This is part 3 of an overview of the Germany Depth Study Unit for the AQA GCSE History course. This is going to have a look at the experiences of German people under the Nazis, so in other words, life in Nazi Germany. When it comes to having a look at life in Nazi Germany, so the experiences under the Nazis, there's 3 overarching areas to think about. So the effect on particular groups like women, children and minorities, the level of control that the Nazis had over the Germans and how they managed to maintain that control throughout their time in power, and the relative lack of opposition that there was to Nazi Germany. And we'll have a look at 1 or 2 examples of some opposition that was more effective towards them, but by and large there is very little opposition throughout, which tells us just how much control they had. For the course, you need to understand the experiences of different groups of people under the rule of the Nazis. So let's have a look first at the experiences of women under the Nazis. Remember that the Nazis had this very traditional conservative view of the role of women. They viewed women as very important, but only for a particular role. So they believed that men and women had very defined roles in society, and a woman's place, according to the Nazis, was within the home. So it's summed up with this phrase Kinder, Kutsch and Kirch, which means children, church and kitchen. So that means that the Nazis believe a woman's place is to bear and raise children. It is to be that traditional female role in the household that is defined by the church. So you are at the instructions of men, you are there to serve the men, you are there to look after your husbands, raise the children, you're there to obey almost as well. And that a woman's role is there to be in the kitchen, it's there to be the homemaker, to make sure that there is a good meal that's cooked to feed your family. The Nazis view women as very important, but it's just that they are defined within this role, that is their role. And it's worth noting that, remember, during the 1920s, when you see that so-called golden age of Weimar Germany, there's an awful lot of people who are more conservative, more right-wing, who don't like the progressive nature of life for women. They don't like what they're seeing about younger women in the cities going out to nightclubs. They think that that's all that's wrong with society. And in the aftermath of the Great Depression, many people think, well, we've got to get back to traditional family values. And they look at the Nazis' policies towards women and they like them. They like those traditional family values. During the Second World War, life for women changes because you've got lots of men that have gone on to fight, and suddenly you need to have more women working in the factories. So Nazi policy becomes more confused. Before the war, it's very clearly focused on women should be at home. So women are encouraged to stay home. They are strongly encouraged, even forced, out of work and out of professions and told that their place should be in home. But then when the war takes place between 1939 and 1945, you get women asked, oh, well, actually, we need you to stay in the home, but also we want you to go and work in the factories as well. So you've got these women going and working very lengthy shifts at factories, but still with the expectation that at home they've got to be that good housewife and that good mother. It's a very confused policy because of the Second World War. Another really key group to look at that often actually comes from the exam is the impact of the Nazis on young people. Hitler had frequently made it clear that getting the young people on side was the key. He realised that if you could raise a generation that just believed what the Nazis were stating, not only would you maintain control over them, but they would do whatever you wanted them to. So within the schools, the entire school curriculum is redesigned to emphasise Nazi ideas. So within subjects like mathematics, students are told to work out how much fuel they're going to need to carry on planes that are carrying a certain payload of bombs, and they've got to travel particular distances to certain cities. So they talk about how planes might have to travel to places like Warsaw, which they quote as being the international centre of world Jewry, unquote. So they twist all sorts of things into it to make people have the mindset that there's going to be a war, and also to emphasise this view that Jews are the enemy. And that is filtered throughout the school curriculum, right down to what we would call primary school age children. So you've got children that are growing up in school constantly being fed this stream of Nazi ideology, which they do not question. The teachers within the schools have to be members of the Nazi Party. So those teachers that are seen as opponents of the Nazis, those teachers that are seen as too left-wing, they are removed from their posts. So you only have Nazi teachers in schools that are controlled by the Nazis teaching a curriculum that is dictated by the Nazis. You have this generation that's grown up there that just believes in Nazi ideas. But that's not enough. It goes further, because as well as controlling what's happening within school, the Nazis have their youth organisations to try and control the activities that they're doing outside of school. So you have, for example, groups like the Hitler Youth that are brought in for boys, and the League of German Maidens for girls. To start off with, these are actually voluntary organisations. They don't become compulsory till later on. However, it is very, very strongly encouraged that you go and join these. And you stand out if you don't join them. Remember that at the schools, your teachers are now the Nazis as well, because they have to be members of the Nazi Party to teach you. And some of those teachers might be involved in youth organisations, or might at least know the local leaders of these Nazi youth organisations. So at school, you may well be questioned about, well, why weren't you there last night at the meeting? Why haven't you thought of joining? You should really join. This should be a good idea for you. There's a lot of peer pressure. There's a lot of pressure from the teachers at your school. You can see why lots join it. It's worth noting too that for many of the children that join these groups, they actually do rather enjoy it. We have quite a lot of first-hand testimony from people that were in these groups who talked about how it was a lot of fun. It was a great adventure. For many poor working class people, it gave them the opportunity to actually go away on some kind of holiday, to get a camping weekend away. It was an adventure. You were away from your parents as well. It's exciting. They got to go out of the big, dirty cities and actually experience the beautiful countryside, not something they really got the option for before they were part of those organisations. So many of them quite enjoy it. We also have accounts of people where they describe how, particularly in the Hitler Youth, they marched through the streets and they felt very proud to be in their uniform, and the public had to salute them as they walked past. It made them feel important and valued, and they really liked that. They really enjoyed it. That doesn't mean that they're all Nazis, of course. There's many young people that love these youth organisations because of the activities, because of the camaraderie, because of that friendship that's developed. They're not loving it because of the ideology they're being taught, but it's also worth bearing in mind that they're being taught Nazi ideology at school, and of course they're being taught that within these youth organisations. So for these young people growing up, they don't know any different. They don't know any different other than what the Nazis are telling them. So they are able to indoctrinate them, and that's the key word here. The young are indoctrinated by the Nazis because the Nazis had such a strong hold over every aspect, over every part of their life. Of course, we need to also consider the experience of minorities under the Nazis, and in particular that of the Jewish people. It's worth noting that Jews, although singled out by the Nazis, made up actually a very small percentage of the German population. Just around 1% of the population was Jewish when Hitler comes to power. So they're not a very big population, but Jews were often in quite prominent professional positions. There were a number of Jewish doctors, there were a number of Jewish teachers as well, and professors at universities. But not all Jews were in such positions. There were many Jews as well that were in much lower working class positions in society. But Hitler has made it clear for years, for decades, that they are a target. And it all stems to his view of the master race. It's worth noting as well that he's not alone in holding these racist views at the time. There is this body of science, this study that emerges in the late 19th and early 20th century that becomes known as eugenics. And it is this belief, and they don't just think actually it's a belief, they think it's scientific fact. We know today it's nonsense, it has been debunked. But there is a group of scientists around that time who genuinely believe that different races are born with certain character traits, physical traits, mental traits that make them suited for different roles in society. And they believe that by just looking at the different races, by measuring particular parts of the body, such as the size of your cranium, your skull, or your nose, you can categorize each person into a particular racial group, and that will therefore tell you what kind of work, what kind of role in society they will be more suited to. And it essentially was saying some races are born more intelligent than others. Some races are born more physically fit than others. And these different races might therefore be better suited to different roles. So Hitler takes this idea, and he's not the only one, there's many that take it, and he thinks, well, that means that there must be one race that is superior to all. And Hitler, along with a few others, decide that the Germans are the pure Aryan race, that they are the master race, that actually they are the best of the best in the world. And he decides that some races are ranked far below the Germans, and some races should not even have what he would think is the privilege of calling themselves human. So this is where Hitler, and many others, it's worth saying, developed the idea that Jews are Untermenschen, which means subhuman. And Jews in particular are singled out and targeted because Hitler genuinely believes they are subhuman, they are parasites, that's the words that he would use, and they need to be eradicated from the earth. Hitler time and again uses the word of they will be annihilated. Annihilated. There's only really one interpretation you can have of that word, isn't there? That he's intending to destroy them, he's intending to kill them. And he's made that clear many times. That, of course, means he's probably going to have to go outside of Germany, because most Jews do not live in Germany. And in the Second World War, when he's then expanded into Poland and eventually into Russia as well, you've then got millions more Jewish people that can be the victims of his perverted view of science. Because there are a core of scientists that have written books about this, that say that this is a thing, there's a lot of people, probably better to phrase it, there's a significant minority of people who believe this as fact. Now, that doesn't mean they think, let's kill them all. That's Hitler and the Nazis' idea, let's kill them all. But there is a lot of people that end up thinking, well, actually, maybe different races are born with different intelligences and different physical traits. So that is a popular view around that time. It is a view that today we know is not correct. We know that is nonsense today. And scientists today have largely abandoned that idea. But around the early 20th and late 19th century, it's a popular view at the time. And it's in that world that Hitler then takes on these ideas and go, well, actually, we should look at resettling the Jews. In fact, no, what? We should look at getting rid of the Jews. We should look at annihilating them. So Jews are targeted because they're not seen as worthy. That's what the Hitler and the Nazis think, they're not worthy. So they're targeted, singled out. Think then about how they're targeted and singled out. Hitler has got the emergency powers, and he's got the Enabling Act, which means that in 1935 they passed the Nuremberg laws. So the Nuremberg laws strip Jewish people of their citizenship. They banned Jewish people from marrying non-Jewish people. They restricted the types of professions they could go into. So eventually Jewish doctors are told that they can no longer have non-Jewish patients. Now, if you think that only around 1% of the population is Jewish, that alone tells us that most Jewish doctors are probably seeing mostly non-Jewish patients anyway. So when you then say, well, you can't see non-Jewish patients, what you're essentially saying is you can't be a doctor anymore. because they're not going to have any patients left. There's just not enough Jewish patients for them to have in their clinics. And they restrict other things that Jewish people can do, for example, banning them from education, so Jewish people can no longer access schools. You are removing them from society step by step. There are, of course, concentration camps during this time, but these are not places like the death camps that are built later on at Auschwitz and Kelmo and Treblinka, things like that. That's much later on. During the 1930s, these camps have a range of people there, both Jewish people and political opponents. They also contain, as you can see here on this slide, many homosexual people. Romani and Sinti gypsies are also placed there. People that do not fit with Hitler's view of Germany end up in these camps, and this is legal because of the emergency powers, which restrict freedom of speech and the right to imprison people without a trial. The Nuremberg laws make it legal to strip Jews of their citizenship simply because they are Jewish. This is something that gets far, far worse during the Second World War, particularly after 1942. So the war breaks out in 1939. There is the invasion of Poland, but only half of it, and Jewish people are targeted then. There is a big increase in the attacks on Jewish people in 1942 onwards, when the war has stepped up and you have the invasion of Russia and suddenly millions more Jewish people that are under their control. And by the way, one more thing that you need to remember about the attacks on Jewish people within Germany. Key event 1938. Remember 1938. There is the Night of Broken Glass, also known as Kristallnacht, in November 1938. It is a night of violence and arson targeted on the Jewish people in revenge for the killing of a German diplomat in Paris by a Jewish man. And the Nazis at the time say, look, this is a choice of the people. The Germans are doing this. I mean, we're not really big fans of it, but clearly the Germans are showing us that they don't like the Jews. That's why they're attacking them. But in actual fact, the Nazis have actively encouraged people to attack Jewish synagogues and businesses. The Nazis are behind it. They want it to happen because they want to intimidate the Jews and force them out of Germany. They want them to leave. They want them to get out of there. Ultimately, they're trying to get people to turn against them. They're trying to get enough people to turn against them so that it will justify what they're going to do next. And of course, what they're going to do next is from 1941-42 onwards, more and more of these Jewish people are going to be sent to camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Kelmo, Treblinka, where they are going to be murdered. One question that often weighs on the minds of students and of historians is, how are the Nazis able to do all of this? You know, how are they able to pass the Nuremberg laws, which then target Jewish people? How are they able to restrict people's freedoms so much? How are they able to dominate the school system? And why ultimately do they face so little opposition? You know, there's just no opposition to them, really. I'll talk more about the opposition specifically after this slide. But there's two things to bear in mind. The Nazis have complete control. Firstly, they control the hearts and minds of people through the use of propaganda. So they were masters at propaganda. That's what helped them get into power in the first place. Remember about the role of Hitler, the way that he presented himself, his use of aircraft to visit as many people as possible, to give that personal touch. It's all about a propaganda. Well, the propaganda continues once they're in power. Joseph Goebbels is the mastermind of propaganda. So all forms of media, newspapers, radio, cinema, it is all controlled by the Nazis. Nothing can be printed in newspapers that is critical of the Nazis. Nothing can be broadcast on the radio that the Nazis do not approve of. Furthermore, the Nazis ensure that radios are cheap. They want them produced cheaply so that more and more people can afford to buy them, and they will put them in their homes. So the Nazis can broadcast their message right into people's homes. That hasn't happened before. This is the first time this happens in history, that actually these leaders can speak to people right in their homes. That hasn't happened before. And they can, because they control what's broadcast, they can just make sure you're only getting the messages the Nazis want you to hear. When you buy a newspaper, it's only what the Nazis want you to read. When you listen to the radio, it's only what the Nazis want you to hear. When you go to the cinema, you're only seeing movies that promote Nazi ideas. So even though you get films that are made about medieval knights and battles, there will be references to how these are German knights, pure Aryan knights, to get across the idea of Nazi race theory. Everything there that you see, hear, read, all says about how the Germans are a great race, and how the Nazi ideas are the ones you should follow. In that context, it's easy to understand how people just accept this as the truth, because they know no different. If there are people who are skeptical, even critical, then there's the element of fear to keep them in their place through the use of the police state or the terror state. So there are people who, even though they're seeing all this propaganda, they see through it. They know that that's not the truth. They question what's happening. They don't agree with Nazi ideas, but not many of them do anything about it. Not many of them openly oppose the Nazis, largely because they are afraid to. Because the Nazis have created this police state. Under Heinrich Himmler, you have this network of the SS and the Gestapo. So the Gestapo are this network of secret police and actually informants. It used to be thought that the Gestapo must have had thousands of agents all across Germany spying on people, keeping them in check. But more recent research has shown that actually in many areas the Gestapo only had a handful of agents, and instead they relied on informants, ordinary Germans who were quite happy to spy on their neighbours and report their activities. Now, maybe those neighbours didn't realise that by reporting on their neighbours, they were perhaps giving them a death sentence. Perhaps they don't realise that. Or perhaps they think, well, you know what, they are being un-German. And if they believe all the propaganda, they might think that they're doing a good service for Germany. So lots of people disappear in the night because their neighbours have reported on them. And as the prisons start to fill up quite early on because of the use of the emergency powers to imprison people without trial, they then have to try and find more space. So this is where you start to find these large concentration camps being built. They are prison camps because the prisons are full. So they build these concentration camps where the inmates are used as slave labour. And as time goes on, especially when the Second World War breaks out and then you get camps set up outside of Germany, the conditions within them are increasingly brutal, horrific, and deadly. So bear in mind that really there's very little effective opposition to the Nazis because Hitler had dealt with his opponents so effectively early on. So in 1933, you'll remember that Hitler has outmaneuvered any of his opponents outside the party with the use of the emergency powers and the Enabling Act. By 1934, on the Night of the Long Knives, he's effectively got rid of any opposition within the Nazi party as well. Across Germany, he has already dealt with any opposition because propaganda is so prevalent across society, from the young to the old, that people just accept what they're seeing and hearing and reading. They don't question it. And if anybody dares question it, then they generally don't because of the police state that's been set up and the fear of what might happen to you if you speak up. Most opposition actually develops when the war starts to turn badly for Germany. So from about 1941-42 onwards, after they've invaded Russia in June 1941, but then they get turned back, and by 1942, it's pretty clear the Germans are on a losing streak. They suffer defeat in North Africa against the British. The Americans are involved by that point. The Russians are turning them back and heading towards Germany. The war is not going that well for them by 1942. And it's at that point that you start to see a bit of an increase in the opposition towards them. But even then, it's not particularly effective. and the Nazis increasingly deal with it with ruthless, brutal tactics. Three groups then to think about. The youth opposition. You have the Edelweiss pirates. These are the people that are going and disrupting Hitler Youth meetings, that are generally causing mischief and chaos. The swing youth, not really a defined group. These are more random groups of teenagers that are meeting and listening to jazz music and talking about sex and drinking alcohol. The kind of things that teenagers often do, eh? That's what they're doing. But it's things that the Nazis see as degenerate. They associate jazz music with black people, and they think, well, that's degenerate, it's terrible, awful music. Why would you want to listen to that from an inferior race? But of course they want to listen to it because it's good music. You then have the White Rose group. This is the group with Hans and Sophie Scholl in it, who are at the university in Munich, and they are spreading anti-Nazi leaflets. So they're often just dropping these leaflets down staircases at the university, spreading the information about how the Nazis are mistreating the Jews, for example, and eventually they are informed on by a caretaker at the university, and they are found guilty, and they are executed by guillotine. You know, a really brutal execution. There are a number of young people, particularly in the Edelweiss pirates, who during the Second World War are publicly executed by hanging, and their bodies are left there in the towns and the cities. It's a sign of how desperate the Nazis became to maintain control by striking terror and fear into people's hearts. So this is where you would find bodies that have been left there hanging, often with placards around them saying about how they had stolen something, or they had been and beaten up somebody, and this is why they'd been executed, or they were a traitor to the Germans, and this is why they're executed. It's to try and make people afraid to oppose them. There's not a lot of opposition from the church. In fact, the Catholic Church itself signs a concordat, an agreement with the Nazis, that the Nazis will continue to let the Catholics exist as long as the Catholics do not criticise the Nazis, and that's the way it stays. There is one Catholic that does speak against them. Bishop Galen famously spoke out when he hears about the Nazi euthanasia program. This was where the mentally and physically disabled children were being killed. They were being murdered by being given lethal injections purely because they were mentally and physically disabled. And Bishop Galen finds out about this and he speaks out against this. And actually, it's one of the rare moments where the Nazis paused the program. They paused the program because Catholicism, and Bishop Galen in particular, were too popular. They were too strong. The Nazis were afraid to continue with it in case it inspired a rebellion. It's one of the very rare examples of somebody actually forcing a bit of a change in policy. It's only temporary, because once they feel that they've got enough support, or they're not going to face as much opposition, the Nazis restart it later on. There is opposition from the famous pastor Niemöller, who's a Protestant vicar. It was Niemöller who wrote the quite famous poem which goes something along the lines of, first they came for the communists, but I didn't speak out because I wasn't a communist, and then they came for the Jews, but I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew, and it ends with, and then they came for me, and there was nobody left to speak for me. It became a very famous poem. It's quite moving to read, and he spoke out against the Nazis trying to control churches, but to little effect. There is still opposition within the army. There are many within the army, even from the start, who don't like Hitler interfering in their operations. And whilst things are going well for the army, they kind of tolerate what Hitler does and the instructions he gives. By the time you get to 1944, and everything is going wrong for the Nazis, they are facing invasion from Russia. They have had D-Day by that point in July 44, because D-Day was on the 6th of June. So the Americans, the British, and the other allies are heading into Germany from the west. And in Italy, their ally Italy is being attacked by the Americans and the British too. So on every front, the Germans are losing. And this is the moment in July 1944 that Klaus von Stauffenberg, a German army officer, and a group of other German army officers attempt to assassinate Hitler. It fails. So Stauffenberg has taken a bomb to the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's eastern headquarters. The bomb is put down in the room next to Hitler. It's in a suitcase. Stauffenberg leaves the room, doesn't really wait to see if it's successful, but he hears the bomb explode. Thinking it's been successful, he then tries to lead an uprising. It fails because Hitler is not killed. Hitler isn't even that injured. He's got a few bumps and bruises, cuts and things, but when the bomb went off, he was on the other side of the room and protected by the very large table that was there. So it isn't successful. But it shows that there are at least some Germans who did try to get rid of Hitler, who did realise that he was going to ruin their country, and they're trying to do something to stop it. So overall, there is very little opposition during the time. And one thing that I haven't really mentioned here, you've got to think as well that these people had voted this guy into power. The Germans had voted Hitler into power. They voted the Nazis into power. Hitler and the Nazis in the 1930s were genuinely popular. And whilst by the end of the Second World War, his popularity is no doubt reduced, there's still a sizable chunk of Germans that have this view that Hitler was all right, he just had bad advice. And that's a view that remains popular with a certain group of Germans right until the 1950s. And it takes time for them to realise that actually he really was as awful as the Allies had been insisting it was, that actually he really was responsible for the horrendous crimes against humanity that had been committed all this time. It takes time for that, though. And that, I think, as well, shows you just how effective the propaganda and the police state was.